thank you for joining us tonight for our virtual event with David Rubenstein. A few quick Zoom housekeeping details before we get started. You are all muted. You'll remain muted throughout the duration of the event. For optimal viewing, use your Zoom view functions to select speaker view so that our author is highlighted on your screen. Please ask questions using the chat box function. We will get to as many of your questions as possible. We are behind the scenes monitoring the chat box, so type in your questions for David there. If at any time you drop off the Zoom or experience technical difficulties, simply click the link again to be readmitted. And if you haven't already, please do not forget to purchase a copy of How to Lead at bookhampton.com or rjjulia.com. You can click on the link in the chat box for quick and easy purchase, or you can visit us in store. We're open for safe, socially distant shopping at all of our locations. So, plus we have signed book plates. So purchase your book now to receive a signed book plate while supplies last. Tonight, we are thrilled to present David Rubenstein in conversation with Bob Barnett. On behalf of Bookhampton, R.J. Julia Booksellers, welcome and thank you for joining us. I'll now pass it off to owner of Bookhampton, Carolyn Brody, to introduce tonight's featured guest. Please give a warm digital virtual welcome to Carolyn Brody.
Well, I wonder what that even looks like. Yeah. Rita. Thank you, Erica. And let me add my welcome to all of you joining us tonight. This is a terrific group of people, and it's really an honor and a privilege to welcome David and Bob. And thank you both for being here, for being with us to talk about David's newest book, How to Lead: Wisdom from the Greatest CEOs, Founders, and Game Changers. John Meacham has likened this book to a Louvre-like gathering of masters talking about things that matter most. And Walter Isaacson has blurbed, reading this book is like sitting in an armchair, listening to the masters reveal their secrets. And it's a fascinating and a timely book. And I have to say that as a bookseller, it makes a terrific holiday gift. So David is many things, but just briefly, he's the author of The American Story. He is the co-founder of the Carlyle Group, which is one of the world's largest and most successful private equity firms. And he's a host of the David Rubenstein Show on Bloomberg TV and PBS. He's also a passionate and a dedicated philanthropist. So welcome, David. And David and Bob are old friends, so it's a delight for us, and for me especially, to welcome Bob back to a virtual event at Bookhampton and R.J. Julia. A number of you will remember that earlier this year when we launched our virtual event series, it was with Bob interviewing Madeleine Albright, and they were brilliant together, and I'm sure that you will see that again tonight with Bob and David. Bob is one of the premier authors representatives in the world with an amazing client roster, from Presidents Obama, Clinton, and Bush to First Lady Michelle Obama, Hillary Rodham Clinton, and Laura Bush, to Barbara Streisand, to Phil Knight, to the Prince of Wales, and to James Patterson. And the list just goes on and on. But most importantly to us at Bookhampton, Bob and his wonderful wife Rita and their family are dear friends and loyal customers at Bookhampton. And so we just love them so much and miss them whenever they're away. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the evening over to Bob and to David. And again, thank you.
Carolyn, thank you. Erica, thank you. It's a joy to be with you tonight. What R.J. Julia does, what Bookhampton does is so very important. Independent bookstores are the lifeblood of literature and reading, and they've had a hard time over the last 7-8 months and hard times ahead. And anything we can do to support you, we want to do, and that's why I'm sure David's here, and I know it's why I'm here tonight. David and I go back almost 50 years. We went to law school together. He doesn't remember, but I actually recommended him for one of his first jobs and have sought a commission on his income ever since. He's never given it to me, but I'm still petitioning. We have a lawsuit. We're hoping to get it. Rita and I need some of David's money. This book is wonderful. Here it is, How to Lead. I'll hold it up multiple times so you all know your price of admission is to please buy it from Carolyn or from Erica. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's a great read, and I think that everybody who reads it learns something from it because he interviews some amazing people and gets them to answer questions they've never heard before and never answered before. David, I'd like to start by saying thank you for doing this and steal from Ken Burns, who interviewed you some weeks ago. I was privileged to listen into it. And the first question he asked was actually the very first question I was going to ask. So I'm going to ask Ken Burns' first question. I've known you for almost 50 years. Every time I see you, you sometimes say hello, but you don't always say hello. Usually you ask 4 or 5 pointed questions about something I'm doing, something in politics, something at the Kennedy Center. So my first question to you is, have you always approached interaction with human beings through questions?
Well, let me answer that first by saying that to say that Bob and I were law school friends is like saying that Bob and I are citizens of the United States. There's a big difference between Bob and me in law school. Bob was at the top of his class, a Supreme Court clerk. I was a middling law school student. So I want to get that out of the way. And secondly, Bob, you're famous for not charging commissions. You only want an hourly rate. So I thought you wanted an hourly rate on my income, not a commission. But
I'll take it. I'll
Okay.
take it, David. I'll take it.
So I grew up in Baltimore and the only child of 2 blue-collar Jewish parents. And my mother used to think called me a yenta because all the guests that would come over, I was always asking them questions. So she just thought that I should be more polite and not just drive in and ask people questions about everything about their lives. And so maybe I'm just continuing that tradition, maybe in her honor, I'm not sure. But I guess I am always curious and have a lot of curiosity.
Now, what interested you in writing this book about leaders? I know it started with interviews, then it became the TV show, then it became the book. But going back to the beginning, what made you, David, want to look at leaders and leadership as such an overwhelming subject of your interest?
Well, we have roughly, I guess, 7.5 billion people on the face of the earth. And if all 7.5 billion people said, I want to be the leader of the earth or leader of my country, we'd be kind of chaotic. So you have to have, in a civilized world, certain people who are leaders of an organization, a state, a country, and whatever. And so I've always been interested in what made certain people rise up where other people said, you know, I don't want to be a leader. I'm happy to be a follower. And so this is an effort to really inspire younger people to want to be leaders by, if they read this book, maybe they'll be inspired to do some of the things that some of the people did. Now, you can't read a book and all of a sudden say, I'm going to be Julius Caesar, I'm going to be Napoleon Bonaparte just by reading a book. It's not that easy. But you can get some inspiration and maybe change your life a little bit. So that's the purpose of it.
Now, in the introduction, which is just terrific because you do your own little brief autobiography saying you're not worthy of a whole book, which I don't agree with, and we'll work on that on another time. You asked the question, which I'm going to ask you. Why should anyone want to be a leader?
Well, I think there are 3 reasons, really. One, I think civilization advances, and that's what life is to some extent all about, advancing civilization in a Darwinian sense. You want to make, you know, the next generation better than the current generation and so forth. So that's going to happen more likely if you have leaders who can move civilization forward. So one, it's good for society, and therefore, if you care about society, you should want to be a leader. Secondly, I think that being a leader is an enjoyable thing if you do it well and you have your ego under control, as I think is important to do. I think it's good for you as a person to be a leader because it makes your life more interesting and I think more fulfilling. And I also think all citizens and all humans have an obligation to help make civilization move forward. And to the extent that if you are a leader, you're inspiring younger people to follow you, I think that's a good thing. And you can feel like you've done something useful for humanity in the future as well.
Now, in the introduction to the book, where you trace your boyhood, you say, quote, "No leader in my boyhood rivaled the youthful, charming, and charismatic President John F. Kennedy." What drew you to him as your first leader you admired?
Well, in my 6th grade class, after his inaugural address was given on January 20th, 1961, my sixth grade teacher went over that address, which is really poetry in prose form, and instilled in me a belief that, a leader can really inspire people by giving a great speech. And so I just kind of read more and more about Kennedy, and obviously his charismatic personality was such that it inspired people in my generation ultimately to go into government service. And you are in my generation, and you went into government service yourself. And so you probably were inspired to some extent by President Kennedy's image. Remember, in your home state of Wisconsin, he won a major primary there, and maybe it had some impact on you.
That's right. No, that's right. In the setup to the book, you describe 3 phases of life. And you set up a framework that I've never heard before. Tell our viewers and our friends that are with us today what those phases are and how you came to define them.
Okay, so it may be a rationalization for my own latter life reasonable success, because I wasn't so successful as a younger person. But what I was trying to say is that if you divide life into 3 parts, the first part is when you're getting educated and preparing for your career. The second part is when you're really mastering your skills as a career person. And the third part is where you're getting the benefits of that, either financial, psychological, or social benefits of your success. All of you who are listening will think about this. When you were in high school or in college, who were the Rhodes Scholars, the White House Fellows, the Supreme Court clerks, the valedictorians, the president of student governments? In many cases, those people coasted in the second and third of life, and they didn't live up to the promise you might have thought they would have had. There are cases, there are exceptions. Bob, you were a Supreme Court clerk, top of your class at law school, and you've been a great lawyer your whole career, but you're the exception. The same is true in the presidential situation. Bill Clinton, who you know well, was rare in that he was a leader in the early part of his life and the rest of his life as well. But if you take the last 10 presidents of the United States, other than Bill Clinton, none of them were really people anybody would have thought would be president of the United States when they were younger. So my theory is that sometimes people who are younger leaders, they either coast the rest of their life, they don't want to be a leader anymore, or maybe they just were a little more mature early on, and for whatever reason, it's the tortoise and the hare phenomenon, and often it's the tortoise that catches up and passes the hare, so that the people who are leading the world later on in life are people who were not superstars early on. So take the leading business people in the world today. Nobody would have thought that Warren Buffett, when he was growing up, was going to be the richest man in the world, or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates. They're all very smart, but nobody said these people are going to be the richest in the world. Or take the people who are running the U.S. government. Nobody would have thought those people would be the people leading the U.S. government at that, when they were kids. So you just can't predict. And so my lesson is, if you are not a superstar in the beginning, don't give up. As George W. Bush famously said when he gave the Yale commencement address, to all of you A students, congratulations, you're going to do very well in life. To you B students, you won't do bad either. To you C students, you too can grow up to be president of the United States. So.
Very good. I noticed in going through, again, in preparation for this, the interviews, you asked several, if not most, of the leaders what their grades were like in high school and college. Does that indicate that you feel that academic success somehow correlates, or how does that correlate in your mind?
It's always interesting to me to see how people did in high school. If they were superstars, did they live up to that promise later on? Most people like to talk about the fact that they were not superstars in high school, and that actually they worked hard, but they weren't the superstars. But they like to point out that they struggled and they came through, and the story at the end is much better than they might have predicted when they were younger. So people like to talk about that. It's rare to get anybody to say, I was a superstar in high school and I'm still a superstar. There are very few people that say that. Usually the people I've interviewed are people who were okay students or maybe good students, but they weren't the greatest of all time. And, it's just an interesting phenomenon I've observed.
The Bezos interview I thought was one of the most fascinating one. And I took a couple of takeaways from that I'd like you to comment on. You ask all these people, obviously, because that's the nature of the book, what defines leadership? How do you be a leader, et cetera, et cetera. And he answers that it's getting a full night's sleep and not making decisions too early or too late in the day. Now that surprised me. What did you make of that?
Of all the interviews I've done, that was the most disappointing answer, because I realized if I'd gotten 2 hours of sleep more every night over the last 30 years, I could have been more successful. If I didn't make any decisions before 10 a.m. or after 5 p.m., I could have been more successful. But I didn't realize that was a secret to a success, getting 8 hours of sleep a night. All those nights I only got 6 hours of sleep, I kind of, would have been more successful. Jeff is a guy who's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. A smart guy, very smart guy. He was valedictorian of his class in high school, so he was very smart. But when he got to Princeton, as he pointed out in the interview, he wanted to be a nuclear physicist. And he realized that there are a lot of smart kids in his class. So one time he couldn't solve a nuclear physics problem. So he went down the hall to an Indian American who was the genius of the class. And this guy took the problem that Jeff Bezos had worked on for 3 days and solved it in about 10 minutes. That's when Jeff realized he wasn't going to be a nuclear physicist. Now, after that, he told that story. Everybody wanted to know, what happened to this guy? Did he go on and win a Nobel Prize in physics? Who is this guy that was the greatest student at Princeton? Well, it turns out they found him out. They found him in the internet, through the internet, and it turns out he's a one-man consulting firm in Southern California. So Jeff Bezos is the richest man in the world, and the other guy who was the genius in the class, well, he's a one-man consulting firm. So you never can predict what's going to happen.
Right, exactly. Another great quote from the Bezos interview, he said, quote, "Most of our regrets are acts of omission. They're things we didn't try. They're things that haunt us." Do you have any of those, David? Acts of omission, regrets for things you didn't try?
Yes. In fact, because I'm Jewish, I'm always looking back and realizing the mistakes I made. I'm always thinking I did this terrible. I always have this guilt or thing. So my biggest one was when Jeff Bezos was starting his company. We had some stock in it, and we sold it at the IPO. Today, that stock is worth about $7 billion. We sold it for maybe $60 million. That was a mistake. Or when my now son-in-law told me about a young man who was dropping out of Harvard to start a company, he described the something that sounded like it was like a dating service. I said, this company called Facebook will never get anywhere. And so, I put in about the $30,000 that they were seeking then. It's worth about, I think, $15 billion now. So those are some of the omissions that I like to think about all the time.
The final thing that I found interesting, and I really agree with as I get older from Bezos, he says, and I know how you believe in this, you don't realize until you look back how parents are so important. I know, had the honor of meeting your parents, I know how important they were to you. Talk us a little bit about your parents.
Yes, my parents were people who were not college graduates or high school graduates. My father dropped out of high school to go to World War II. He came back, he met my mother. They got married at the age of 20 and 17, which seems ridiculously young, but apparently that was not uncommon then. And so I was their only child. And so naturally, they gave me, not naturally, but they did give me unconditional love. And as Warren Buffett likes to say, the greatest thing you can give your children is unconditional love. And it's not money or other things. And as you have all probably observed, everybody listening or watching, the hardest thing in life to do is raising children. As Jackie Kennedy used to say, if you mess up raising your children, nothing else in life really matters. And she was right. And all of us who've grown up in modest circumstances know that it's a lot easier to be successful in life if you've grown up in modest circumstances than if you've grown up in wealthy circumstances. I have 3 children. I think that they're in pretty good shape. They're all well educated, I think hardworking, but they will never be able to have the drive that I had coming from where I came from, just because they know if they don't succeed at what they do, that they're not going to be on the street. So I think there's a big advantage in growing up in modest circumstances. And I often ask people about this. In fact, in every interview, I like to ask people, did your parents live to see your success? And you can't wait to see how many people want to talk about that subject, because everybody wants to make their parents proud of what they've done. And I think more people talk about the pride that their parents had in what they did than they did about their own pride in what they've achieved. And so I think it's very important if your parents can live long enough to see your success, to do that. And I think it's one of the great pleasures in life is seeing your parents happy with what you've done.
Yeah, I noticed that you asked many people that, and I was going to inquire of that. So thank you for explaining that. Now, certain of the leaders that you interview have multiple skills, like Jim Baker, who we were talking about earlier, was an athlete, a lawyer, a politician. Condi Rice was a musician, an academic leader, a political leader. Do you think most of these leaders are good at one thing, or they could be good at all things?
Certain people have a number of skills that are helpful. So if Jeff Bezos had gone into something other than the internet selling books over the internet business, I think he would have been successful. Bill Gates could have gone into almost any business and been successful. They're both very driven, hardworking, smart guys. Some people got luck, though. And as I mentioned in the categories of things that I think are important, luck is the most important thing. Yeah, a lot of people recognize that luck helped them get along, with their career. And so, yeah, some people would not have been as successful if something didn't happen. And for example, take Abraham Lincoln, a very talented person, you might say. But let's suppose we didn't have a civil war. We didn't have a civil war, Abraham Lincoln probably wouldn't be heard of. Or FDR, suppose we didn't have World War II, he might not have been heard from. So you can have modest skills or reasonable skills, and in circumstances might make you put those skills together, but you're going to be much better known because you came through in a crisis situation. You rose to the occasion.
This year, particularly over the last few months, our country has become more and more aware of the systemic racism and sexism that exists in our country, unfortunately. What do you think enabled certain of the leaders who you profile, examples, Indra Nooyi, Colin Powell, Oprah, Condoleezza Rice, to overcome those barriers and become so wildly successful while so many others have had to struggle? What are the particular characteristics of those people?
I think all of them did not let the racism wear them down or the sexism wear them down. Condoleezza Rice would say her father said to her, you can't control what other people think about you, but you can control what you think about yourself. And so don't let the other people wear you down, in effect, is what she said. And so I think that Colin Powell or Condoleezza Rice, both of whom overcame fairly racist situations, I think basically concluded that if they're going to get somewhere in their life, they couldn't worry about that issue, and they had to go forward and do the best they could in the circumstances they found themselves. There's no doubt that overcoming these problems made these people stronger leaders, in my view.
You asked Bill Gates a question which I want to ask you. You have run an incredibly successful business, built, invented, run an incredibly successful business, and now you're running an amazing philanthropic engine of the most broad form. For those of you on the call who don't know, David saved everything from the Washington Monument to the Pandas to Mount Vernon to the Constitution, United States Declaration of Independence, Emancipation Proclamation, and the list goes on and on. You asked Gates, what's the difference between running a profit-making business and, in his case, running a foundation, your case, running an amazing engine of philanthropy? What are the differences?
Well, clearly, in business, you have a very easy metric, profit, loss, earnings. You can basically measure your success by something that everybody understands what it takes to be a successful business, which is, say, earnings or share growth or so forth. In the nonprofit world, there is no readily accepted metric where you can measure whether you're successful or not. Now, Bill has tried to apply metrics to what he does, and maybe he can do it reasonably well. But generally, in the philanthropic area, there's no metrics that everybody accepts. People are trying to come up with metrics, and there are some that you can maybe use, but there's no agreed upon thing like earnings or profits in the nonprofit area. But Bill has brought to the nonprofit area the same kind of skill, drive, passion that he brought to the business world. That's why I think almost anything he put his mind to, he'd be successful at. Some people, like me, I don't really apply that much in terms of metrics into the nonprofit area. I generally have what you would call a Potter Stewart approach to it, which is I know the success when I see it, which is to say, if I give some money to something and I generally get a report on it, I can figure it out without having a team of analysts go in and tell me whether it's successful or not. And to some extent, you have to use your own judgment and intuition, which is a point that Jeff Bezos made. He said all of his great decisions in life came about through intuition. He didn't hire McKinsey to figure out whether he should do Amazon. He used his intuition. The same thing is true in all the things he did to build Amazon. And there's no doubt that Warren Buffett is not reading 500-page memos from his staff on whether to make an investment or not. He has a certain intuition, and I really would trust people's intuition more than I would trust the judgments of consultants who are telling these people what to do.
Now, in conjunction with your incredibly philanthropic work, you've signed something called the Giving Pledge. For those who don't know, tell us what the Giving Pledge is and why you signed up.
The Giving Pledge is something that Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, and Melinda Gates developed, which basically says that you're going to give away upon your death or during your lifetime at least half of your net worth. And about 40 of us signed it at the beginning. Now we have about 200 people. And it's really not going to change the world all that much, in the sense that if 200 people give away half their net worth, it's still a drop in the bucket. Even if they gave away all their net worth, it's a drop in the bucket. The real view of its importance, in my view, is to inspire other people who are not of the net worth required to be in the Giving Pledge to give away some money, or to give whatever they can give. And I like to remind people that philanthropy is derived from an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. So you can love humanity with your time, your energy, your ideas, or your money. And the most valuable thing you can give is your time, because you can always make more money if you're inclined to do so. You can't get more time back. So I like to remind people that they should do other things if they don't have money to give that can help with philanthropy. And I think I signed it in part because I got very lucky in my life, and therefore I felt an obligation to give back to the country, among other things, for my good fortune. And I also recognize that many people who have enormous net worths are actually tortured souls in some way, because if they don't find something useful to do with the money, i.e. give it away in some useful way, I think they feel they're relatively unhappy people. And I think the happiness that you're going to get from giving away money or helping other people is much greater than having another piece of art or another house or something.
You are a devoted reader of books. You've now written a couple, and hopefully we'll do some more. Tell us why you think books are important, and why they're so much better than the short form that we all live by today.
Some of you who are watching or listening may have the same experience that I had. When I was 6 years old, I was eligible to get a library card. So my parents walked me to the local library, got the library card. You could take out 12 books a week. I would take them out and I'd read them on the same day. So I had to wait a whole week to get another 12 books. I should have figured out how to get around that system. But I loved reading books because I grew up in a house where my parents didn't have the money to buy a lot of books. And so I was dependent on the library. But it opened a whole new world for me. And I love reading now. And as a result, I've gotten involved in creating the Literacy Prize at the Library of Congress to kind of do things that promote literacy. And I think it's a sad situation in our country, but 14% of all the adults in this country are functionally illiterate, which means they can't read past the 4th grade level. And I don't mean somebody came from Cuba that can read Spanish but can't read English. I mean people that can't read their native language as well. And that's a sad situation. Many people who cannot read wind up in our juvenile delinquency system or in our federal prison system. 2/3 of all the federal prison members or people in the federal prison are functionally illiterate. There's another problem that I wanted to talk about as well, which is called illiteracy, which means you can read, but you choose not to do so. And this is hard to believe, but 30% of the people in this country who graduate from college never read another book in their life. 50% of the people in this country who can read have not been to a bookstore or bought a book in the last 5 years. So now why books as opposed to newspaper articles or tweets? Well, I'm not sure tweets are that uplifting, but leaving that aside, books focus the brain, they focus the mind. And when you read a book start to finish, you have to concentrate, and it makes your brain much more developed, and I think it helps you as a human just understand things and think better. So if you read a lot, I think you're going to be a better person rather than just reading, newspapers or magazines. I read those too, but there's nothing that functions the brain as much as reading a 300, 400, 500-page book. To get through the end is a certain discipline. You learn more. You have to think. You're in a separate world when you're reading that book. That's why I think books are extremely important. And I've been involved for the last 10 years as the co-chair of the National Book Festival, which we have in Washington every year. This year we had to do it virtually. But I think book festivals and things like that promote, particularly to younger people, the idea that reading a book is better than reading a comic book or reading a newspaper article. I think that's very important.
Well said, and I'm sure everybody on this call agrees with you. Before we get back to your book, do you have a couple to recommend other than yours?
Well, any book that Bob represents the author is by definition great. So I would say that all of Bob's books, but I've recently, I have a program that's now called, do it at the New York Historical Society, where I interview authors and we put it on television on PBS. And there are a couple that I've done recently and a couple that I'm about to do. But one that I'm going to do there, and I've interviewed the authors in another context recently, is the new book by Peter Baker and his wife, Susan Glasser, on Jim Baker, the man who ran Washington. I think it's a great book. and I think it certainly will be nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. It certainly deserves one. And I think the new book by Jonathan Alter on Jimmy Carter, my former boss, is a really well-written book and gives information about Carter that even I didn't know. And I say on Baker, I knew him pretty well too. He was in my firm for 12 years, but I didn't know a lot of the things that are pointed out in the book. I do think another really good book that I recommend to people is a book on leadership that's a little different than mine. It's a book by Eric Larson on Churchill's first year as prime minister, called the Vile and Splendor. And it's about how he really took over as the first year as prime minister and really, in my view, helped to save England from the Nazi onslaught. A really spectacular book.
You now all have Rubenstein recommendations.
Oh, and another one is the Bob Woodward book that I would also highly recommend, Rage, which is it. I won't say it's uplifting, but it's certainly worth reading.
Yes, yes. Back to your book. Several of the leaders you interviewed, when you asked them characteristics of a great leader, particularly I noted Richard Branson and Oprah, said being a really good listener. Have you found that you have been a good listener and that that's helped you be a leader?
Well, listening is important. Oprah would say, she's not a great interviewer, she's a great listener. And I think it's a very effective technique to actually listen to what people say. So maybe the reason I ask people questions a lot at the beginning is I want to see what's on their mind, listen to what they're interested in, and I think it can be very helpful. When you're having a business meeting, if you let the other person talk from the beginning and you can see what he or she is thinking about, I think it can help you a great deal in getting what you want. So I think listening is very, very important, and I think the best interviewers really are the best listeners.
You also asked a lot of these people, including Oprah, what are you most proud of? And I ask you that, David. You've done so many things. What are you most proud of?
Well, other than my friendship with you, Bob.
Thank you.
I guess I'm really happy that my parents lived to see, that their only child got to be someone that other people admired. That was probably the thing I'm most proud of. And then secondly, the fact that people think that I've done something that helped the country in some ways, because everybody wants to help their own country, I think. And some of the things I've tried to do to restore historic properties or save historic things, and people think that's good for the country. I think that's been a good thing. But in the end, as you know, Bob, and as everybody listening knows, the thing that we're all the most proud of, if you're fortunate to have this, is your children. And so in the end, the legacy that we leave behind to some extent that matters the most is our children. So I'm very proud of my children, what they've accomplished so far. They're relatively young in their career, but still, I think I'm very proud of them. So probably that's what I would say I'm most proud of.
Yeah, no, family's critical, and you've always been so supportive, and you've got 2 grandchildren now too, which is the greatest thing. And I think on this Zoom call, I see my sister, my 2 nieces, I think my daughter, and I'm very proud that they're on here too, and that we've gotten to know your family, David, over the years too.
Well, thank you, Bob. And I would say that, having 2 grandchildren makes you realize you're getting older in life. And also, you kind of realize more about your own mortality. Like in my own case, I'm an aging baby boomer. I used to think of myself as a baby boomer, but when COVID came along, all of a sudden people said, well, you're a senior citizen now, so you got to be more careful. So I'm trying to be more careful. And you realize with COVID, all of us who are on this call, if you're a senior citizen or you're around a senior citizen age, you realize you probably can get access to reasonably good medical care, and you'll probably live for quite a while. But with COVID, you could be gone in a relatively short period of time. So it's made me rethink my own mortality, and actually came home to roost when my children and my 2 young grandchildren got COVID. I have a 6-month-old grandson and a 2-year-old granddaughter, and they both came with COVID. So, you realize if they can get it, certainly somebody like me could get it. So it's kind of a scary situation.
Are they okay?
They are okay now, but, to be honest, nobody knows what the impact of COVID is 1 year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now. Who knows what the lingering effects are going to be? We don't know.
Yeah, no, you're right. Now, you asked, there's certain threads throughout the book. I've mentioned some of them. One, you ask many of these people about setbacks. halts in their career, stumbles, and so many of them have had them. What do you think the impact on one's leadership skills and success of setbacks are? And have you had any, David, that have been particularly influential on you?
Well, my view is that nobody can have an unimpeded trajectory to the top. If you have that, something's wrong. There were some people I knew early on who had no mistakes, no failures in their career, but they reached a point in midlife where they weren't used to failure. When something went wrong for them, all of a sudden they fell apart because they weren't used to failing and they weren't used to picking themselves up and getting back on their feet. So all of us have failed. Bill Gates has failed. Jeff Bezos has failed. Everybody I think that I've written about has failed, had lots of problems. In my case, as you know, Bob, I worked in the Carter White House, and all of a sudden we lost the election. So although I didn't think that was possible, I thought, how could the country elect a 69-year-old man president of the United States? Too old, I thought. He can't even get out of bed in the morning. I'm 71 now, and it doesn't feel so bad. But I thought that 69, I was then 31, was too old. So we lost. I had to go out and get a job again. And nobody really wanted to hire me because I wasn't really a skilled lawyer. I'd only practiced law for 2 years. And so I didn't want to tell my mother nobody wanted to hire her only child. So I kept saying I had so many offers, I didn't know which one to take. And after about 6 months, she kind of figured out that probably wasn't true. But I did go back and practice law. And the good thing is I was such a bad lawyer, I knew I had to get out of that business.
Bezos gives you an excuse to stay in bed. He wants you to sleep late. And of course, when you get up, immediately go to your iPhone and order some things from Amazon, which I suspect is something that we all know about. Now, interestingly, Eric Schmidt's interview, which I thought was interesting, he said something that I really didn't agree with. And I wondered what you think. He said that the key is becoming an expert in something. He said, quote, "You need to be incredibly good at one thing."
Yes.
I don't agree with that. I think most of these people are good at a lot of things, and generally being good at one thing is not going to propel you to success. What's your view?
Well, I think what he was trying to say, he may not have articulated it the right way, is this, and I say it in my words too. Learn how to focus on one thing. Make one thing something you really know how to do well. When you know how to do something well, people say, this person knows how to do something well in this area. Let me give him or her a chance in this area. And then you expand your kind of reach. So, Bob, you were a very talented lawyer in one area, let's say, and all of a sudden somebody said to you, well, Bob, you're really good as a litigator. Why don't you try representing broadcasters? Bob, you're really good at representing broadcasters. Why don't you try representing authors? Bob, you're really good at representing authors. Why don't you represent, other kinds of people, presidential candidates or something? So from your focus on something where you're really good at it, then you can expand that. I think that's what he meant to say, and I kind of agree with that.
Yeah, great. That's a good explanation because that didn't come clear, really.
Right.
It didn't really come.
Well, it was bad editing by me.
In the second edition, we'll clean that up.
Okay, I'll fix it in the paperback.
Now, someone like Coach K, Mike Krzyzewski, has a skill set that's incredible. Would he be able to transfer that skill set to being a business leader or a politician? Are leadership skills transferable or non-transferable?
Well, it's clear that it's harder for business people to translate their skills into politics than people might think. But in his case, he is a person who knows how to motivate young men to be great team players. And I think he would know how to motivate business people to be great as well. So I think he would be very good at almost anything he tackled, where you had to bring people together and kind of get them to mature and so forth. And he's done an incredible record, as everybody probably knows, for 40 plus years. But he had a losing record at Army as a coach. In the first 5 years at Duke, he had a losing record. And he got close to being fired at Duke, and he held on. And it just shows you the importance of overcoming failure and persistence. As I say in the book, persistence is probably as important as anything, because if you just give up, if you have a little roadblock or setback, you're never going to get anywhere.
There are two other, speaking of Coach K, there are two other themes that go through the book consistently and repeatedly: Duke and Baltimore. Right. Why are those two themes so dominant in this book?
Well, Baltimore is where I grew up. It was, most people look on fondly on their childhood home, and I'm from Baltimore. It was a very unusual setting. Baltimore was the most rigidly segregated city in the United States by religion, because the mortgages forbade you to sell a home to somebody that was black or Jewish. Now, that was outlawed in Shelley v. Kramer in the Supreme Court in 1948, but Baltimore never got the word. So they kept discriminating against people who were Jewish. They wouldn't sell them houses. And so all the Jews had to live in one narrow area. And so I lived, until I was about 13, I thought everybody was Jewish. Then I realized later, most of the world is not Jewish. But I look fondly upon my youth, as most people do. And so I guess that's why. And Duke is where I went to school on a scholarship, and I was very happy to get it. It wasn't a basketball scholarship, I can assure you, but I went there, and they were very nice to me. And I later, repaid the gift by being the chairman of the board and spending some time helping them on projects. So I am very fond of Duke.
There also were some great business life tips in this book, David. And one of my favorites, you and I talked about this briefly, was Indra Nouri's idea of sending letters to parents of her executives. Explain that. I thought that was fabulous.
Yeah, Indra Nooyi, for those who don't know, she was a native of India, came to the United States to get her business school degree at Yale, and then rose up and served as a CEO of Pepsi for 12 years. And she was one of the few women CEOs in the United States. The Fortune 500 today, there are probably less than a dozen women who are CEOs in the Fortune 500 companies. It's a very, very small group. She was one of the few at the time. She's not there now, but she was also the only one who was also an immigrant woman rising up to be the head of Pepsi. And one of the things that she came up with, an idea that she actually got from India, was that she would write letters to the parents of her senior employees, giving them report cards on how their children were doing. So naturally, they were usually favorable. And so if your employee gets a letter from his mother or her mother saying, your boss just sent me a letter saying you're really good, your boss must be a really nice person to send me that letter. It kind of bonded the employee with the Indra Nooyi, because they figured, if you're telling my mother I'm great, then I really like you. And so she used it as a way to keep people at Pepsi, and I guess it kind of worked.
I thought it was brilliant. I was talking to her about this. She's a good friend and a client, as you know. And she said that the parents just loved these. That one guy framed it and put it up in the lobby of his retirement home and sat there one day a week with Xerox copies giving them out. And she said that the reactions, she got over 400 letters back, and that the impact of just that human gesture was incredibly powerful.
She also said one interesting thing in the book and the interview as well. She was just about to be named president of Pepsi. And so she comes home, her mother's in her home, mother's visiting from India, and she gets home and is about to tell her mother the great news that she's going to be the next president of Pepsi. And she says, Ma, I got good news for you. The mother says, I don't care about your news. Your job is to go get the milk. The kids don't have any milk. She said, Ma, I have really important news. Get the milk. Come back when you have the milk and the kids have had the milk, then you can tell me the news. And
That's right.
She realized that when she was at home, she was a mother and she wasn't the CEO of Pepsi.
It's a great story, and one of the best interviews in the book. Now, speaking of Indra, another theme throughout, Melinda Gates, Indra, so many others, was women helping women. Ginny Rometty.
Right.
Find that's got better. Madeleine Albright famously said, much to her chagrin after a while, there's a special place in hell for women who don't help, and she got in all kind of trouble for that. Do you think women helping women has become more prevalent? Why is it important? Talk about that theme from the book.
Well, I think it's women. There aren't that many women who are CEOs. Obviously, there are many other women in business, much higher percentage than when I was starting out in my business career. But I think women would say, well, look, I think there's some discrimination for sure. And if women can help other women, it probably evens it a little bit. It's a little bit harder sometimes for men to be close mentors of women for all the obvious reasons. So it may be easier for women to be mentors than men in some cases. So I think that women recognize that, and it probably is a good thing.
Another theme, George Herbert Walker Bush, of course, was a dear friend of yours, and just a man I so admired. Got to play him a few times in debate rehearsals, as you know. He was talked about a lot in this book by his son, by Condi, by Jim Baker. And the same theme came up in all three of those interviews, that one of his characteristics that made him a great leader was that he was humble in victory. And do you find that these people, you've met them all, are many of them humble? I don't have that impression.
Most leaders are people who, in my view, made mistakes, failed, and therefore they overcome those things, and they recognize that there's some humility there because they made mistakes. There's a lot of luck in life and so forth. So I think a lot of them are humble. Most of the people in the book, they have humility. Like George Herbert Walker Bush was very humble. Now, I admit there are some well-known leaders who are not humble. And I don't imagine that if I got the chance to interview Julius Caesar, he would have shown a lot of humility. Or Napoleon Bonaparte probably wasn't that humble. And if your name is Alexander the Great and you attach the great to your name, you're probably not that humble. But most of the people I've interviewed, I think they really do have humility. And my recommendation to people is that, they should try to be humble because they're lucky. But if they can't be humble, fake it. It's much better than being arrogant.
There's a great story told, I think, in 2 of the interviews about how after the Berlin Wall fell, they
Right.
wanted Bush to go celebrate and dance on the wall. And he said, no, that's not for us. That's for Germany, which I thought was a great story.
Right. He famously was told by his mother, never use the word I. So he didn't have complete sentences, as you probably know, in preparing Hillary and others to debate him. Was it Hillary or the others you were preparing to debate?
Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton. So he always would have sentences. He would say, he'd begin with the verb and then end with the end of the sentence. He wouldn't use the word I because he didn't like to brag. And so when the Berlin Wall fell and everybody said, go over there, take credit, he said, that's not for me to do. It's for Germany. And he made the right decision, as all of his colleagues later admitted.
Yeah. Couple more questions, then see if there are any from the audience.
Bob, can I ask you a question for a moment?
Yes,
I ask
David.
you one question, which is
Yes,
this.
David.
How did you get to be a famous representative of people who are authors, who are people writing books? I mean, you were trained as a litigator at Williams & Connolly, a firm that is known for being a good litigation firm. You started out, I presume, as a litigator after you finished in the Supreme Court. So how did you get this practice where you're representing, all these authors and other media personalities and president of the United States? How did that come about? Was that luck? Did you focus on it? Did you want to do this? How did that come about?
In 1984, Ann Wexler, who was a dear friend of yours and mine, the late Ann Wexler, and I were given the job of preparing Geraldine Ferraro for her vice presidential debate with George Herbert Walker Bush. And even though they lost, Jerry and I became great friends, and everybody wanted Jerry's book, First Woman on National Ticket, beautiful, smart, funny. And so I hired a literary agent to do it because I'd never done it. And we ended up getting the biggest advance at that time in the history for an autobiography by a political figure. Then when David Stockman, who you remember, came out of the Reagan administration, I said to myself, I can do that, and I don't need to do it on a 15% commission. I can do it as a lawyer. So I interviewed with David to take that job on. He, liking the model of charging by the hour, took me on as his representative. We beat the record and got the biggest autobiography in political history. Then I'd had one Republican and one Democrat, and it went from there. Then, of course, I got James Patterson, the biggest selling fiction author in history. And then I had nonfiction, fiction. You mentioned Bob Woodward. And so the rest was history. It's a great part of my practice, a lot of fun. And sometimes it leads me back to law school, friends like you, to do books, which is great.
Where's your book?
Nah, never. Too much attorney-client privilege. People come up to me all the time at parties, as Rita knows, and they say 2 things to me. They say, first, everybody says I ought to write a book. And my answer is, are any of them publishers? Or they come up to me and they say, everybody says I've got a book in me. And I say, no, too much sex and violence. And I walk away, and that's the end of the conversation. Now, one more for you, a couple more for you.
Okay.
Thank you for the question, David. Very kind. You ask questions that no one else would ask. You ask Oprah why she called Oprah. You ask Bill Gates, why did he do Control-Alt-Delete to start a computer? Are there any questions you wish you'd ask these people, but you didn't ask these people?
Well, what I do is I do prepare, and I try to commit the questions I want to ask to memory. And as you get older, if you have 35 questions you want to ask, you'll probably forget 1 or 2 of them. So that's the case. But, if you ask people an offbeat question, I think that sometimes it elicits a humorous response. If the person has a sense of humor, sometimes they don't. So Bill Gates, I've asked him a question one time in front of an audience, or with no audience. I said, Bill, do you think if you'd actually gotten your college degree, you could have been a success in life? And he thought it was a serious question, started giving a serious answer. When I asked the same question in front of an audience, they laughed right away. He gets the point. His sense of humor is not so well developed. He didn't realize what humorous question. In Oprah's case, I've asked her, how come you only have one name? And then she pointed out her real name was not Oprah, it was Orpah. Her parents named her Orpah, but they spelled it wrong on her birth certificate, so they just kept it as Oprah. Everybody enjoys a kind of humorous question, and people don't mind making fun of themselves a bit and showing their humility. So I think it kind of works.
Now, David, in law school, no one saw this sense of humor. Now you are one of the most humorous speakers in Washington. How did you develop the humor part? We didn't know that, David.
Well, it's relative. Being one of the funniest people in Washington is not a high bar, right? But I would say, I guess humor is a sort of a self-defense mechanism. So, people that have good sense of humor are often people that are, they're masking something else, I suppose. So I didn't think I was a great, superstar in anything, and maybe having a sense of humor got people to listen to me more than my good looks or my great athletic skills. I don't know.
Well, Rita and I and Meredith love your sense of humor. So
okay, well, thank
keep it
you.
up. Quick lightning round, 30-second answers, and then
Okay.
we'll turn it over to Erica, see if she has
Okay.
any audience questions. Number one, which of the leaders you interviewed impressed you most?
Well, and I think Jim Baker is a very impressive person. I was my partner for 12 years, but what he accomplished in Washington, D.C. is really extraordinary. And as a business leader, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates are just extraordinary in what they built from scratch. I never interviewed Steve Jobs, so I really can't say what he did. I've interviewed Tim Cook, and he's in the book. But I think those are all very impressive people. But look, nobody's more impressive than somebody that actually became president of the United States in certain circumstances. So Bill Clinton and George W. Bush interviewed together. They both have a lot of impressive things to talk about. And interestingly, when I asked them, do they miss being president? Because, it's a great job. And I thought they would say, no, being a former president is a better job than being president. They didn't say that. What they said is there's nothing quite like being able to help people when you're president of the United States. And that's why it's the best job there is.
What's the number one takeaway that you learned from these interviews? From who and what was the number one takeaway for you, David?
Number one takeaway is that if you are polite to people and you know them and they open up, you can get them to tell stories that they might not have told other people. And if they don't feel they're being, interviewed for 60 minutes or something like that, I think they can be much more forthcoming about their failures or their frailties and so forth. And that's what people tend to like when they read the interviews, is people talking about their weaknesses, their failures, and maybe their insecurities.
Were you most of these people, but some you know better than others. Was there anyone who made you nervous or intimidated, or who you kind of were leery of doing this with?
I knew all these people before I interviewed them, honestly. So it wasn't, the first time I met, some of these people, you meet a president of the United States for the first time, it can be intimidating, or you meet Oprah for the first time, or any of these well-known people. But when you get to know them after a while, I wouldn't say they were intimidating. In fact, of all the people I've interviewed, I really wouldn't say I've been intimidated by any of them. And that's probably because maybe I've become more arrogant as I've gotten older. And so I just, I don't feel that I realize everybody, is human, and they all make mistakes, and they all have their insecurities, and nobody is so wonderful that it's like interviewing God or anything like that. Maybe if I'd interviewed Napoleon, maybe I'd been intimidated, or maybe if I'd interviewed Einstein, maybe I'd be intimidated, but I don't know.
I think you once told me you were intimidated by Attila the Hun. Is that right?
Right. Well, if I could interview anybody, I probably would have wished I could have interviewed Abraham Lincoln. And, I don't imagine he would say, I won the Civil War all by myself. I think he was probably a more humble person. Or if I could interview, Henry VIII, I would say, Henry, why didn't you get a prenup instead of killing all your wives by chopping their heads? A prenup would have been easier. Or interview Cleopatra and say, who was a better lover, Mark Antony or Julius Caesar? We really want to know. But it's interesting that the interview format, as we now know it, is a relatively novel invention in the history of mankind. So we don't have interviews of Julius Caesar or William Shakespeare or things like that. And I think it really traces back as a form of entertainment to the Tonight Show in the early 1950s, when Steve Allen was doing it initially, then Jack Paar. they would bring people on to interview, and then ultimately interview shows took on, and then people took on the life of interviewing people in front of other people. But we don't have that format, so there are no interviews of Abraham Lincoln. There are no interviews of George Washington. There just wasn't a format. And so it's sad, but I wish we could go back and interview these people, and maybe someday I'll get to interview them in heaven or some other place.
Maybe the next book should be David's Imaginary Interviews
Right,
with
yes.
Lincoln.
Right.
All right, last question, last lightning round. Did you ever look at anyone across the table during these interviews and say, wow, you're really rich?
No, because to be honest, you know, when I didn't have any money, I might have been more impressed with people that have money, but a lot more than I do. But now that I have some money, it doesn't impress me because I realize it's just a fungible thing and it's a lot of luck involved in it. And no, I'm more impressed with other things that somebody might have done, but not, you know, being a Supreme Court clerk impresses me more than having a lot of money. And you were a Supreme Court clerk and you used to play basketball with Whizzer White, right?
Yes, yes, I did. For 4 nights a week in the highest court in the land.
And did you dunk the ball on him ever?
No, but we weren't allowed to call fouls, and he was brutal, and I left that clerkship with a broken hand, a broken leg, and a broken foot. So it was combat basketball.
So I'm more impressed with being able to play with Whizzer White than I am that somebody's worth $10 billion. I mean, you know, I realize that that's a lot of luck.
Thank you. Thank you. Erica, back to you. Do you have any audience questions to wrap up with a couple of those?
We do, just a couple. So thanks for sticking with us for a few minutes past the hour. First, I just want to say thank you to both of you for your support of books and, you know, supporting the importance of reading and independent bookstores. Obviously, that means a lot to us. And I couldn't recommend The Splendid and the Vile more highly. We love Eric Larson. We had him here as well, and that is a fantastic book. So anyway, all of those recommendations were great, and just your support and love of bookstores is it's so important. So we love that. Okay, so first question from the audience. Speaking of family dynamics, you mentioned the idea that if you come from more modest means, you may have a more innate drive to succeed. Do you think being an only child or having siblings would affect that drive?
The studies have been done over the years, and they tend to show that firstborn and only children are a bit more driven. I didn't do those studies, but that's what they tend to say, and I would not be surprised because if you're an only child, you get more attention from your parents, presumably, and that attention might lead to you being, you know, more self-confident or being, you know, more able to do certain things or have better skills. So I do think there are advantages to it. On the other hand, I've interviewed a number of people who said to me, I'm the 12th of 12 kids. And look what they achieved. They didn't say that, but you know, so lots of times you could be the youngest of 7, 8, and you still achieve things. So it's not a universal thing, but there's no doubt that probably only children and maybe firstborns tend to be slightly more likely to be leaders, but there are obviously an enormous amount of exceptions.
Yeah, and then actually another question about youth and family. What's your prediction for the youth of today growing up during the pandemic? What age group will thrive or rise to the challenges we're facing? Who might falter in these trying times? Might it level the playing field between youth of privilege versus youth of modest means?
I think it's going to exacerbate the differences. In other words, those people that are wealthy today and have internet access, high-speed internet, access to all the kind of Zoom conference calls and other things are more likely to pull away in skill set and self-confidence and abilities and in job skills and than people who don't have internet access or living at home with 5 other children and in a single parent family without a lot of the means that wealthier people have. So I think a lot of the people are going to be falling further and further behind in my view. Now, I would also add that virtually every generation has always said the next generation coming after them is a disaster. There's a story about George Washington's father telling George Washington, your generation's going to get nowhere. You haven't done anything. You guys are terrible. Well, every parent probably says that about the younger generation. And I think the younger generation usually proves it's better than the older generation. So despite the fact that COVID is likely to create greater inequalities, I do think the younger generation has many more skills and more capabilities than my own generation did.
Great, yeah. And then this will be the last question. The giving pledge you mentioned sounds incredible. What organizations do you recommend giving to most? Is it a
What
national?
organization? I'm sorry, do I recommend?
What organizations? Yeah, giving to
Okay. Here's what I,
national, global, local.
well, first, the most elusive thing in life is personal happiness. So if you can find something that you give to that gives you personal happiness, that's the most important thing. So getting personal happiness would be useful, I think. But secondly, the standards that I use are these. They're not the same as Bill Gates or other people, but people that I would recommend they think about are this. Find something where you can start something that wouldn't otherwise get started. Second, find something that you could finish that wouldn't otherwise get finished without your help. 3, get something that you're likely to see the benefit of and the progress during your lifetime. And 4, something that you're going to be intellectually interested in doing more than giving money to, but willing to stay involved with it. And you will find the intellectual excitement as important as the money that you give.
Hear, hear. I
Great advice.
couldn't agree. It's great advice. Carolyn, do you want to wrap us up for the night?
Carolyn, before you do, everybody buy this book. It's just a great read. You'll enjoy it. There's so many good interviews. David needs the money. He needs to buy sandwiches.
Now, all the money goes to Johns Hopkins Children's Hospital. So actually, so all the money goes to Johns Hopkins Children's Hospital, which is a wonderful children's hospital. Thank you.
Oh, thank you both. You absolutely were terrific, brilliant, and your friendship really shows through. So it's wonderful to listen, wonderful to watch. And, as Erica said earlier, it means a lot to Bookhampton. It means a lot to RJ Julia to have you with us. And, the sales mean a lot to us, our stores. So please think about that, everybody. And as I say, this is a book that makes a terrific, terrific holiday gift. And we do have book plates, so that makes it extra special. So again, thank you everybody for joining. And David and Bob, really thank you so much.
Carolyn, thank you very much for inviting us. And there's an old saying, next year in Jerusalem. So next year, we'll do this in person in the Hamptons with another book, okay?
Yes, absolutely. It's a promise.